Good evening. Welcome. This lecture series is named in honor of St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, and usually I begin the evening with a prayer from him. But today is the feast of another doctor of the church, St. Jerome, so I will recite a prayer composed by him. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. O Lord, show your mercy to me and gladden my heart. I am like the man on the way to Jericho, who is overtaken by robbers, wounded and left for dead. O good Samaritan, come to my aid. I am like the sheep that went astray. O good shepherd, seek me out and bring me home in accord with your will. Let me dwell in your house all the days of my life and praise you forever and ever with those who are there. Amen. St. Thomas and St. Jerome, pray for us. Okay, so tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Center for Law and the Human Person, which I am privileged to serve along with Professor Mark DiGirolami as co-director. We are also grateful to our co-sponsor of tonight's event, the university's Institute for Human Ecology, for helping to spread the word. A few logistical matters. Outside, we have flyers with details of upcoming events. You can also join our email list on the sign-in sheet to stay informed and receive our newsletters. And you can also visit our website for videos of past events and just in general to learn more about our center. As I said, tonight is the third annual Aquinas lecture. And in this lecture series, our goal is to feature scholars of the natural law engaging a range of topics such as freedom's relationship to truth, the role of law in one's growth and virtue, and tonight's topic, the relationship between law and morality. Now, some of you, I know we have a number of 1Ls out there, but some of you law students may not realize that our law school, Catholic University of America's Law School, has a storied tradition of promoting the natural law. From its beginning, the school's curriculum and its emphasis on jurisprudence, Roman law, and natural law set it apart from other law schools. The founding dean, William Callahan Robinson, saw, quote, scholastic philosophy at the heart of the law school. Brendan Brown, the sixth dean of the law school in the 50s, was a renowned scholar of the natural law who believed that the institution's main purpose was to form its students in the existence and the controlling ethical order which communicates meaning and significance to positive law. The emphasis on the moral foundations of the law is also at the heart of the mission of the Center for Law and the Human Person. The gold rays illuminating the man in the center of our logo refers to man's participation through the natural law in the light of God's eternal reason. And I want to sidetrack for just a little bit of trivia here. Speaking of gold rays, I want to draw your attention to the artwork that we chose for tonight's event. This is a painting of Moses having descended from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments in hand. Those commandments that perhaps, we'll have to see what Father Legge thinks, most aptly demonstrate the integral connection between law and morality. So those rays coming from his head are meant to capture what Scripture recounts in my Bible, and this is from Exodus, that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. So thereafter, Moses veiled his face when addressing the people. St. Jerome, again, today's saint, famously translated shone as horned. And if you've seen the famous sculpture of Moses by Michelangelo in Rome, or any domers out there, the First Down Moses sculpture on Notre Dame's campus, they don't have rays of light like this painting does. They have horns on Moses's head. So rays of light versus horns is a debate I will leave to the scripture scholars, but I wanted to just share that bit of trivia in light of today's saint, St. Jerome. Okay, So let me turn to tonight's speaker. It just so happens that all 3 lectures in the series have been given by Dominican priests, members of the Order of Preachers, quite fitting, again, given the the lecture series namesake. Our inaugural speaker was Father Aquinas Gilbo, our dear university chaplain and vice president for ministry and mission, here with us tonight. And then last year's speaker was Father Michael Sherwin, professor of fundamental theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. So I'm very pleased to welcome the third in the series, Father Dominic Legge. Father Legge currently serves as the president of the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception at the Dominican House of Studies here in Washington, D.C., right across the street, for those of you who haven't found your way over there yet. Prior to this position, he served as the director of the Thomistic Institute and associate professor in systematic theology at the same institution. He is an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and holds a JD from Yale Law School, a degree from the School of Philosophy of Catholic University, and a doctorate in sacred theology from the University of Freiburg. He entered the Order of Preachers, and this is of particular interest to our law students, in 2001 after having practiced constitutional law for several years as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. He is the author of the Trinitarian Christology of St. Thomas Aquinas. I will add here that it was, Father Legge was recently described to me by Father Sherwin, actually, as a lawyer who would have become Solicitor General of the United States had he not happily instead become a Dominican priest. So please join me in welcoming Father Legge. His presentation this evening is entitled, How We've Gotten Law and Morality Wrong and How to Fix It.
Thank you.
I don't know if I agree with Father Sherwin, but it's an honor to be here and for his words, but even more Elizabeth's words and the welcome here at the Catholic University School of Law, which is a great institution, and thank you for having me. When I was working at the U.S. Department of Justice in the 1990s, I read an encyclical that had come out a few years before, written by Pope John Paul II. The encyclical is called Veritatis Splendor. I read it in my free time, but I remember carrying it in my briefcase to work and reading it, going back and forth, and also reading it at home. And I was puzzled by this encyclical because John Paul II spoke about morality and law and freedom, but in ways that I could not understand. These were things that I was very interested in, but what he said didn't seem to make sense to me. The more I investigated it, the more I began to discover in the way he spoke about these concepts an alternate thought world, one that I had never discovered in my studies in law school or my studies in political philosophy before I'd gone to law school. And this new thought world didn't match the categories that I had in my mind. It forced me to push my mind to think in new ways. And in fact, it required some study of ancient and medieval philosophy and the history of late medieval developments that led to the Enlightenment and to much of the legal theory that we're more familiar with today, to uncover what John Paul II was talking about. So this talk that I'm going to give tonight is a little bit of a kind of an expose of what I have learned and the way I had to change the way I thought about these ideas and the new world that opened up ahead of me once I began to understand that. I think, as I'll try to discuss in this talk, that the notion of law and its relationship to morality that most of us operate with has its origins in the nominalism of the 14th century. A famous name there would be William of Ockham. Perhaps you've heard of him. Which then was the framework against which many Enlightenment thinkers that have much more directly influenced our contemporary American and British legal landscape, it framed the background in which they worked. So figures like Hume or Locke or Kant and so forth. And through this historical development, there was a change in the meaning of the very words that we use in this tradition, like law, morality, the good, freedom, nature, natural law, natural inclinations. And because of these changes, it makes it very hard for us today to understand the older tradition, because we think we know what those words mean when we read them in those texts, but they're not being used in those texts in the way we might expect. So, in fact, this older tradition, I think, is very rich and has much to say to us today, much that can be a corrective to the misunderstandings about the relationship between law and morality, and that's really the theme of my talk. I think the older tradition is more powerful and true in its expression of what law is and ought to be, and more broadly, and I think more importantly, about the meaning of human life and of each of us individually, as well as the meaning of our common life together. Okay, so that's just my little intro to the talk. Now here's the outline of the main points I want to make. The first question really is, I think, about morality. And rather than starting with law, I'm going to start with morality and then work my way to law. So you often hear people talk about this, like in a contemporary law school context, by saying something like, it's a problem if we try to legislate morality. Or shouldn't we, in a pluralistic society, try to come up with laws that are morally neutral? And that sounds good initially. But I think we need to ask, well, what do we mean when we say moral or morality? What qualifies a law on this view as being morally neutral? And is it really realistic for us to have laws that are like that? That's really the first question that I want to take up. And then after that, I would like to talk about law. So by talking about morality, actually, I hope we will see that we're building up towards an understanding of what law really is. What is a law? And my claim to put the conclusion up front is that law is always ordered to a good, and that's the meaning of morality. So in fact, these ideas are intrinsically connected to each other. Okay, so that's like where we're going to end. All right, so what is morality? This is really my first question. And I think here we should start by trying to clear up some confusions. I want to challenge and reject the commonly held assumption that morality principally concerns commandments or rules or law or sin. So maybe, Elizabeth, this is to be a little controversial here by saying you chose the wrong image for your poster. Maybe that isn't what morality and law is all about. Or maybe we'll see how we can bring that back in the end. I'll leave that for you to judge. Okay, on this view that morality principally concerns commandments or rules about law, sin, on this view, obeying the will of God is moral, and disobeying God's will is immoral. So on this view, the command or the law, the will of God, is in a certain sense outside of me or above me. It's imposed on me. And then I respond by making a choice. To obey is morally right, to disobey is morally wrong, and I make that choice as a kind of autonomous, free decision. Now, there are, in fact, I think, three overlapping positions here on the meaning of morality or moral. And I think all three involve some measure of confusion that obscures the true nature of morality, and thus also of law, the good, freedom, and much else. Okay, so the first confusion hiding here, I think, is probably the one that most quickly comes to mind in a contemporary secular law school environment. I don't know if you would find that here at Catholic University, but you certainly would find it at many other law schools. The first place the mind might go when you say morality in the context of law is sexual morality, Christian sexual morality. You might first think, especially in American context, that when we say having moral laws or laws dealing with morality, we're talking about laws that enforce specific provisions of the Bible. So you imagine an evangelical preacher thumping you over the head with the Bible about what you do in the bedroom. So that's often where people first go when the idea of law and morality comes into the picture. That morality is mostly concerned with sexuality. Okay, I don't mean to shock you, because I am a Catholic priest and I do believe in the moral laws of the church, of course, but I think that this is a poor definition of morality. And that's not at all what I intend to talk about this evening. Okay, the second confusion is a little more general than this. That's the view that morality is about biblical commandments more generally. Okay, so this is like the first, but maybe broader. You could say, what is moral is whatever conforms to a command coming from a higher authority, especially from God. And this view of morality really became prominent in the 14th century, and especially associated with William of Ockham. I think that also is an insufficient or misleading way to talk about morality. A third confused claim would be to say what is moral is what conforms to duty. And that here might also include norms imposed on us by reason, as well as by God's will or by divine revelation. So this should make you think of Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative. There's an authority which is somehow external to ourselves that imposes some duty or imperative on us, and to fulfill that duty is to act morally. Okay, notice that in each of these claims about morality, all three of them really, there is an inherent conflict, at least we could see it on the horizon, between what is moral and what is free, like whatever I might want to choose. So if morality is about duty, obeying a command from above, it seems like it necessarily isn't doing what I might prefer or what I might choose for myself. Now, I think that this involves a terrible confusion because it sees morality as always the opponent of human freedom, maybe even as the opponent of human happiness, insofar as I want to be free to choose the path that I decide for myself will lead to my happiness. I think that leads to a lot of human suffering to think about morality like that, because it makes us think that part of the nobility of the human being, which is above all that we're rational and therefore free, is somehow lost when we act morally, since morality, on this mistaken view, I think, involves subordinating our freedom to some external command or some duty. And that same view also would suggest that law is intrinsically in conflict with morality, and that's something, or that law is intrinsically in conflict with freedom, and that's something that you find very commonly in our own contemporary legal landscape. The idea is if you have a law, then freedom is constrained. To have more freedom, you need to have less law. It's precisely that I would like to call into question, and it may seem paradoxical at first, but I would ask, just be patient with me for a minute to try and work out this account. Okay, what then is morality? If we set aside these three overlapping, mistaken ideas. In an older framework of thought, for figures like St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas, morality actually refers to aiming at a goal, how to achieve the goal. And above all, what is the goal of human life? It is to be happy. Or, to put it another way, to achieve the true human good. Okay, so to understand a little bit of this older sense of morality, think about morality tales. Now, you're probably familiar with them. Think, for example, of Aesop's fables. These are like morality tales. So think of the story of the tortoise and the hare. You remember that story, right? The tortoise is slow and steady. The hare runs fast, but takes a break. And we could ask, well, what is the moral of the story? The moral of the story isn't about a commandment, like run slowly. That's not the point of the story. What is the point of the story? Slow and steady wins the race. That's the moral of the story. So it's not primarily about giving you a commandment. It's about teaching us how to win, teaching us how to achieve our goal, teaching us something about the virtue that we need in order to achieve that goal and to win in a larger context of life. So the story is teaching us something about the nature of life. It's not teaching us about a set of rules imposed from outside. It's manifesting something about the nature of life and success in life. So this is a modest but important classical form of morality and of moral teaching. It points us to truths about reality, about the world we inhabit and about ourselves, that will point us to our own flourishing or our own success, our ability to achieve the good. And for Thomas Aquinas and for St. Augustine, this is exactly what morality refers to. Lessons, forms of thought and reasoning, practical guidance that will guide us towards our goal, which is what is truly good for us, something that helps us attain some measure of happiness. Now, it's true that we could formulate a set of commandments for the hare to help him win the race, like don't be arrogant, or finish what you start, something like that. But that's not what morality is principally about. It's not principally about the commandments. Morality is principally about attaining the goal or seeking the good. Okay, framing morality in this way puts us on the path to understand the nature of law and its relationship to freedom in a way that avoids all of the confusion and apparent opposition between these ideas. Okay, so now I want to take up the question of what is the good? We've just said that morality has to do with pursuing the good. So the next thing we ought to ask is, well, what exactly is that? Here, we might run into a problem of definition if we try to define the good. Modern theories tend to treat this term as an evaluative or value-laden term. So you might define the good as what conforms to moral law and its precepts. And in some modern theories of ethics, the good might be what is required by the moral law, but not what I desire. Thomas Aquinas does not approach the question this way. And he didn't try to give a strict definition of the good either, because he saw it as a primary notion. So Aquinas describes the good by its effects. He says, for example, that the good moves the appetite. And so he says we describe it as what all desire. The good is desirable. So when he asks, what is the good, he would say, it's what you desire, kind of in the first place. Now, Aquinas thinks that it's a fundamental metaphysical truth that being is also convertible with goodness. Insofar as something exists, to that extent, it's good, at least in some sense. And so this gives rise to a second way of describing the good for Aquinas, equally important to desirability, which is the good is what perfects a being. The good is what perfects a being. Okay, so this is like a metaphysical statement. What does a thing need to exist the way it ought to? That will be good for it. And a thing seeks its perfection. It seeks to remain in being and to achieve the perfection of its being. And that's another way of describing its desire for the good. A thing seeks the good. Now, then we could say, all right, well, what is the perfection of the thing we're talking about? Well, that's, of course, going to depend on the thing we're talking about. Perfections will vary just as beings vary. The perfection of a plant is one thing. The perfection of an animal is a different thing. The perfection of a person is another matter, a higher matter than the perfection of a plant or an animal. And this is exactly how Aquinas then talks about the good, and in certain hierarchies of good even. So we could ask, for example, about a plant, a tree, an apple tree. How do you judge if an apple tree is a good tree or not? How do you judge what will make it a better tree? Well, a good tree does what an apple tree is supposed to do, like bear good apples, bear good fruit, and it does it well. So a tree that does that well, we would judge to be a good tree, and things that will help the tree do that better, we would say is good for the tree. It is leading the tree towards its perfection. It attains to its end. Okay, simple enough. When talking about a tree, like an apple tree, we want it for good apples. And we can understand, like, okay, the perfection of a tree or the perfection of a dog. What is the perfection of a human being? What is the end of a human being? That is a much more complicated and difficult question to answer. A good person will be the person with whatever qualities or traits are needed to live well, or even to do perfectly whatever it is that human beings are most characteristically supposed to do. Well, what is that? This is a classic philosophical question. We could start off by talking about perfections that we have on the level of our bodily life. I mean, just like a plant or an animal needs a certain environment for it to just sustain its life, so do we. On the biological level, there are certain things that we need. So we could talk about health. Well, health is obviously leading us towards our perfection. But a human person has a perfection that is higher than a plant or an animal, and that perfection is connected to what makes us unique. Well, what does make us unique? Well, our spiritual souls, our power of intellect and will, our capacity to know and to love. So to be able to know something and to will it, to know the good and to choose it. So we could begin to give a definition of a human person as a being that exists in the bodily realm like we do in the natural world, but that aspires to perfection not only on a physical or biological level, but also on the spiritual level. A human person seeks friendship, seeks love. Would you think that you had a good human life without friends, without love? A good human life means a person will seek justice, will seek truth. When we begin to see the human person in this way, and when we frame the good for the human person in this way as a perfection, then we see that the good is an end. It is a goal that guides our activity. It's what Aristotle would call a final cause. It's what we're seeking by our action. So the distinctive thing about human beings is that we are able to know the good with our minds and to direct our actions towards the good. But of course, we also know that this comes with a danger for us, which we don't see so clearly in the animal world, of the misunderstood good, or of our desiring something that is only an apparent good. And this problem of ignorance of what is really good for us becomes greater with sin. As we sin, our intellects are clouded, our appetites become distorted, and this makes our search for the good much more difficult. Here I might just add a little footnote. Probably many of you know this. Aquinas thinks that it's a fundamental truth, a kind of unbreakable metaphysical law, that everyone in every action always acts for the sake of some good, either real or perceived. Now, it may be not truly a good, but even someone who is seeking something that we would judge to be very evil, like to murder an innocent person or to wound oneself, that person seeking those evil things is seeking them because in some way they are desirable to him. And that is to say, in some way he regards them as a good under some aspect. So Aquinas thinks that every human action is always seeking a good, even if we would judge it to in fact not be a true good. Okay, if you want to train people about how to seek perfections, what do? Well, you may begin by telling them some of Aesop's fables. That's actually a way that we teach children about the goods that they should seek and the virtues that they should acquire. If you were trying to learn how to grow healthy apples, if, for example, you were an apple farmer and you're trying to hand on to the next generation success in growing apples on this farm, you probably would have a set of practical guidelines, practical wisdom for, pruning the trees in this way and harvesting the apples at this time and irrigating them in a certain way. And that can give rise to a genuine body of knowledge which can be summed up in some shorthand rules. These might be, kind of rules for growing good apples. And this, from Aquinas' perspective, is effectively the same kind of reasoning that gives rise to law. So now we're moving more explicitly into the domain of talking about law. If you want to raise good apples, you will have a certain set of rules for it, and these are a kind of law for achieving the good of the apple tree. What will cause the tree to flourish? You should do more of that. It's derived in part from our experience of raising good apples. Long years of practical experience with human communities can begin to teach us something similar. What kinds of things does a human community need so that you can give rise to justice, to the protection of friendship, to the seeking of truth, to a certain measure of health and material prosperity? These are practical questions that arise out of the community's desire to seek genuine goods for itself. And we do this kind of reasoning all the time, writ small, in our families or in our personal lives. And Aquinas thinks that this is the very same kind of reasoning that is happening when we think about law writ large. So I think we are now ready to talk about Aquinas' definition of law. It's a famous definition, and I hope you'll see very quickly how connected it is to all the things we've been talking about. Aquinas defines law in this way. Law is an ordination of reason for the common good, made by one who has care of the community, which is promulgated. Okay, so Aquinas doesn't frame law as being about a moral obligation or a commandment handed down by the will of God. He says it is an ordination of reason for the common good, made by one who has care of the community, which is promulgated. Okay, so let's look at, we're in a law school. We can look at the essential elements of the definition. Just like you would if you were in a criminal law course, you want to know the essential elements of this particular criminal offense. Okay, the first essential element. Law aims at the good. So, we're aiming at not just any good, but the common good. What does that refer to? Well, here I will refer you to Father Aquinas Gilbo, who is one of the great experts in our contemporary time on this subject about the common good. But if I can try to summarize, we're talking about the good of the human community as a community. So what pertains not only to individuals or private goods that maybe are owned by the community, we're talking about what is good for the community as a community. Something that we hold in common. Classic example of what is the common good would be justice. So in a state, you want the state to be just. That belongs to everyone who belongs to that political community. It's not owned just by one person or one group. Everyone is better off when the community is just. Okay, the second element in Aquinas' definition of law, it's an ordination of reason concerning the common good. Okay, so law is always aiming at the common good, but now we specify that it's an ordination of reason with respect to the common good. That's because we as human beings have the capacity to observe and understand the world around us. And so to understand what is good for our community and to order our activity towards that good, we use reason to discern how to achieve the good, how to arrange things to achieve the good. And that's what we're talking about. So then the third element, it's made by one who has care of the community. This simply refers to the fact that when we're talking about a human community, someone needs to direct the function of the community and coordinate it as it moves towards its good. So law arises when someone who is properly constituted with care of the community promulgates, that's the fourth element, promulgates an ordination of reason to order the community towards its good, towards its flourishing. Okay, so this is a very quick summary of Aquinas' definition of law. But what we can take from that is that law for Aquinas is not principally about commanding people to do things. It's about ordering people with the use of reason to the good that is proper to the human community. And it implies that law is something that we can reason about. So we can deliberate about what the best law is. You cannot argue with a despot who simply imposes the will of the ruler on the community. The argument against that is, to try and get him to change his mind, I guess, or to try and force him to change his mind. But law for Aquinas really is something that pertains to reason. And it appeals to creatures with reason. So part of the idea behind the promulgation of law is that then we begin to also recognize what is really good for our community and the way we should behave to order our community towards its genuine good. The best community is going to have citizens who recognize what is good for the community as a higher and nobler kind of good, as a good that belongs to them. And so they will not have like an interior division in themselves about choosing to pursue that good. It will be something that appeals to them, that's desirable to them as they come to grasp it. And that's why law, at least in theory, should be able to be something that we also desire to conform ourselves to, rather than simply something that is imposed on us. Okay, Elizabeth mentioned natural law, so I want to at least say something brief about that. What is natural law on this view, according to Aquinas? Or maybe a better way of putting it for Aquinas would be the law of nature. Aquinas thinks that we come to know the law of nature when we use the power of our minds to look at the kinds of beings that we are, to examine what leads to human flourishing and flourishing human communities, and then to order our communal life towards that good. So, for Aquinas, natural law is not a terribly complicated idea. We can say, for example, that it belongs to the natural law to protect innocent human life. It's fairly easy for us to see that a human society that doesn't protect innocent human life is going to be a miserable place to live. So this belongs to the natural law. But of course, as you try to get into more particular, obscure corners of questions of law, there will be less clarity from the natural law about exactly what is required. And that then shows us the function of positive law. This would be the law that human beings, say legislative assemblies, actually deliberate on and promulgate. For Aquinas, the positive law arises from diverse human cultures and the wide scope of different possibilities for human flourishing. So, a city in Greece might need laws that are rather different from a city in Alaska, where the climate and the form of life and the things that sustain human life are very different from what they are in a very Mediterranean climate like Greece. There are certain things that will need to be safeguarded in every political community, like protecting innocent human life, forbidding murder. But at the same time, there may be lots of variations in what we will want in political communities, so that each particular community can order itself towards its good in its particular circumstances. And this is the role of the positive law. So the positive law has a very important function, and it should always respect the natural law, because the natural law, after all, is showing us what is like the fundamental baseline for human society and human flourishing. But the positive law makes much more specific judgments about the good for this particular community. And of course, some of those judgments might be mistaken. And that's why the positive law can be revised in a way that the natural law cannot be. This then, I think, leads us to some conclusions about law and its relationship to morality. In other words, how to fix our mistaken conceptions. So much more could be said here, but in the interest of time, let me just present a kind of short concluding summary. The first point that I want to make is that understanding law in this way, by getting away from the idea that it's just obedience to the commandment of a superior, shows us that sometimes we can question the positive law from the perspective of the natural law. It is legitimate for us to ask whether the positive law is rightly formulated and is respecting what, say, justice requires. Even decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court are sometimes unjust, and we could point to some very famous examples of gravely unjust laws in our own human culture. We don't want to simply appeal to a kind of positive law that's higher than the Supreme Court, like the U.S. Constitution, and say, that's going to answer all of our questions. I think ultimately, law always involves reasoning about what is good. And this is my second point. We can't just solve the problems that we have over disagreements about the laws by appealing to a higher lawgiver who's going to, just hand down the commandments. We need to be able to reason about what is good for human communities. And that is a difficult thing for us to do today. So part of what I would like to suggest to you is some of the difficulty that we face in our contemporary political or legal environment, where we see such dramatic conflicts and divisions, even violence, is found precisely here, that we don't agree on what is good, or perhaps we don't agree on what kind of beings we are, and therefore what is a flourishing human being. If we don't understand what human persons are, then it won't be possible for us to come up with a good account of what makes a flourishing human person, or what is good for a human person. If we don't have an account of what a human community is, it will be very difficult for us to come up with a consensus about what is good for the human community. So these are questions like, what is a human person? What is good for a human person? What is good for a human society? That in principle we could address without any reference to divine revelation. And I think we'd be making moral claims about what the law ought to do if we were to have a conversation like that. That is fundamentally a moral question. It is not necessarily a religious question. Although I think divine revelation helps us a lot in understanding this question. So I don't want to suggest that we never refer to our religious traditions, but it's just to see that to talk about law and morality is simply to talk about law as aiming at the good. And I think you perhaps should be able to see from this, the pursuit of laws that are morally neutral is therefore a false goal, because every law, on my account, will always necessarily aim at some good, whether it acknowledges it or not. And that means that law is always making moral judgments. Legislatures are constantly making moral judgments. The real question is whether we acknowledge that that is in fact what we are doing and have an honest conversation about the goods that we are trying to pursue collectively. And allow me to make a final concluding point, which is there's much in the world that we can use to discover the principles by which we can make these judgments. And I think that's perhaps a starting point for the conversations that I would hope we would be able to have about what law ought really to aim at. Morality is about ordering our lives towards the authentic good of the human person, and that's something that in principle should be accessible to us in some way. But that the Catholic faith, I think, does the best job of all those on offer at articulating and exposing to our minds. So, in the end, I would want to say the law is a teacher. It is always a moral teacher. The law always is telling us what good we should pursue. And if we understand law and morality in that context, we can begin to understand also how to solve the difficult problem of human freedom. And this is the point that I'll conclude with. If we are made to achieve the genuine good, and if our wills reach out for what we perceive to be good, then the highest exercise of our freedom is for us to use our minds and the rational desire that emerges from it, which is what we call the will, to seek the goods that ennoble the person. And this ought also to be precisely what law points us to. So this is the synthesis that you find in St. Augustine and in St. Thomas Aquinas, and also in John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, about why law is not necessarily in conflict with human freedom, and why morality isn't either. The best way to pursue the genuine good for the human person is to have a law that also teaches us what that good is, and as we come to know it, it's something that our wills will also spontaneously desire and can become the object of our free choice without an interior conflict, without law suppressing our freedom. Rather, law guides it and ennobles it. Thank you.